Let's begin with the easy stuff. We'll write some tests for React presentation components first. As we discussed in previous modules, the vast majority of the components in our app should be dumb presentation components. They should simply take some props and return some markup. This makes testing clean and simple. We can just assert that given certain props, we receive the expected output. Now, when testing React components, we have to choose between shallow rendering and rendering to an actual DOM. Shallow render is faster than rendering to a real DOM. Why? Because shallow rendering tests a single component in isolation. Child components aren't rendered. However, there are some limitations with shallow rendering. At the time of recording, shallow rendering doesn't support refs and testing interactions. These limitations may be solved in the future since Facebook is actively working to improve shallow rendering, and it also considers shallow rendering the recommended approach in the future. So we'll use shallow rendering to test our presentation components, but in an upcoming clip, we'll need to test interactions between parent and child components, so we'll use the slower render into document style at that time. And to clarify, since we're using enzyme labels render into document as mount. But understand that behind the scenes, enzyme will be calling React test utils and using its render into document function. Because again, enzyme is really just an abstraction over React test utils. Let's use shallow rendering to test the same React component with two different technologies. First, we'll use React test utils, and then we'll write the same tests in enzyme for comparison. Before we get started testing, I'd like to change a setting on Mocha's test reporter. Right now it's set to progress, but I'm going to change this to spec. I normally like to keep it set to progress when I'm doing development because that really helps minimize the noise that's written to the console. But during our initial creation of tests, I think you'll find the spec reporter more helpful because we'll be able to see details about the specific tests that we've written. And with that all set up, we're ready to write our first tests. First, let's add a test for the course form component. So I'll come over here to the course folder, and here's our course form. And I'll just add a new file, and I'll call it courseform.test.js. We'll begin by importing the libraries that we need. We're going to need expect, which is our assertion library. We'll of course need React. We're going to use React test utils, which I'd already mentioned, which is available under React add-ons test utils. And finally, our system under test in this case will be the course form. Now let's add our describe block. If you're not familiar with Mocha, the describe block is used to group and label your test, so you can nest multiple tests inside. For our first test, we're going to test that the structure of our component is what we expect. Normally, I'd just put the name of the file under test right here, but I'm going to call this group of tests course form via React test utils because we're going to create these same tests with enzyme in a moment so you can see the contrast between the two approaches. And I'm using an arrow function here, but you can also, of course, use an anonymous function if you prefer. For our first test, let's assert that a form and an h1 tag are rendered within our form. So I'll use the it function, which allows me to describe what I'm trying to test, which in this case is that it renders a form and an h1. So I am naming my test. And to get started with React test utils, it's helpful to create a setup function that will return us the output of rendering the component under test. So let's create a function called setup up above right here. And the first step is to create an instance of the React test utils renderer. And now we can render the course form component. Finally, to get the output of this render, we need to call getRenderedOutput. Now we're calling course form without any props. We need to pass some props in. I could just add them here in line, but instead I'm going to declare them up here above for readability. And I'll just paste in the object. And now I can just update the course form to put these props to use. And I'll use the spread operator to make that happen. Remember, the spread operator works on objects too. So this syntax is equivalent to me typing out the props one by one. Quite handy. And finally, let's return a few items from this function that might be useful in our tests. So this way we'll be able to get an object back that contains the props that we set, the output, and the render in case we need it. And that's it. Now that we have our setup function, it'll be far less painful to work with React test utils. So let's shift our focus back to writing our first test. To begin, let's call the setup function that we just created and get a reference to the output property that's being returned. So this will be the output of us rendering the course form. And now that we have our hands on the output of rendering our course form, we can make assertions on it. First, let's write an assertion that the top level tag that we're receiving is form. Because if we go look at our course form, we can see that the top level tag is form. So I'll open up the command line now and run npm run test watch. So this will run our tests and watch them. This way, anytime that we hit save, it should rerun our tests. And we can see we have two tests running here. Our first test, which we wrote in the environment setup module at the beginning of this course, and our course form via React test utils. You can see that that's passing as well. So our first test is passing. So we know that we've got our hands on our course form and that the form tag is the top level tag that we're receiving because the type is form. And now we can get a reference to child elements using output.props.children. So here I'm going to destructure the array that's returned from children and say that the first element is an H1. We're expecting that first element to be an H1 because if I go over to the course form and I look at the children under form, the first child is H1. Of course, the second child would be a text input, the third child would be a select input, but I just am interested here in the H1 for this test. So this is just saying take that first element and give it a variable name of H1. Again, let's make sure that we have what we expect here, so we'll write another expect statement that expects the type of H1 to be H1. Hit save here and we can see again that our test is still passing. So great, we've completed our first test using React test utils. Let's add a couple more tests. This is obviously a pretty trivial test. Let's do something that's a little more interesting. Back over in the course form, if we scroll down to the bottom, remember this save button? And we wanted to change the value of that button depending on whether saving was true or not. When it was saving, we wanted it to say saving. Otherwise, we wanted it to say save. So let's write a test that asserts that this is working as expected. So let me just paste in this next test and we can talk about it. What we have here is a test that says the save button is labeled save when not saving, because we expect it to say save when we're not saving. What we do is we call setup again, we get our hands on output, and then this time we're going to get the fifth child so that we know the fifth child is a submit button. And the reason that it is the fifth in the index here, we can come through here and say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it is an index of 5. And then what we do is write an expect statement based on the value of that submit button. We expect the value to be saved because right now what we did was called setup with a parameter of false. Now if we look at our setup function, right now we can see that saving is hard-coded to false. So what we want to do is actually take a parameter up here on setup and we will call this parameter saving. So effectively now we're adding a little bit of power to our setup function so that we can change the props that we're passing down to our course form. So now we've updated our setup function so that we can pass a parameter into it. And when I hit save here, we can see now that our test is passing, that the save button is labeled save when not saving. Now let's test the mirror image of this. Here what we want to say is the opposite. We want to expect it to say saving ... when it is saving. So you can see we're calling the setup function, but this time we're passing true instead of false. So that will end up setting saving to true. Otherwise this code is the same, we're just asserting now that it should say saving ... instead. And when I hit save, we're in good shape. We can see that test passes as well. Alright, so now we've seen a basic example of working with React test utils. Let's build the same tests in Enzyme for comparison.